Maryland, Alabama, and Florida began the practice of convict leasing. Toward the end of the 19th century and in the early decades of the 20th century, southern states leased prisoners to mining operations, farms, and companies building the railroad. The deal was a moneymaker for the states, local law enforcement officials, and the companies. Many southern states ended the practice by the beginning of the 1900s leasing, but it continued in Alabama until 1928. In the early decades Blackman of the 20th investigated southern states for the Wall Street Journal. He says that in the beginning, many black prisoners were simply sent back to the farms on which they had worked as slaves.
By the time you get a little ways into the 20th century, this has essentially become a labor practice to provide workers for very large-scale, massive coal mining operations, and to a lesser degree, lumbering operations in the swamps of South Alabama and Florida.
Were white prisoners not also leased out?
There were. We've pieced back together those records that exist, and generally the population of those who were sent of charges. And it's also very clear as you reconstruct this that there were profound financial incentives that had been created which fed this system so that county sheriffs and other local officials made a great deal of money personally off fulfilling these labor contracts for the private companies that were involved.
So you could end up doing hard labor even if you hadn't committed a crime that would seem to merit that.
A very common circumstance involving thousands and thousands of individuals that we found was, for instance, a young black man would be arrested and charged with vagrancy, which is the crime of not having a job, or gaming, which would essentially be being at the site of a dice game on a Sunday in a black community, something like that. Within a day or two, fairly summary judgment, they'd be convicted of the crime, fined $5 or $10 by a judge, which was a fairly substantial sum in, say, 1908. And most of these individuals in that period of time couldn't pay a $5 or $10 fine to begin with, and so they would be sentenced to be leased to a company, and then the fine would be paid out of the proceeds of the lease. But what became most dramatic was that in addition to the fines, these individuals had to pay a variety of fees, a fee to the sheriff, a fee to the witnesses who testified against them, a fee to the deputy sheriff who brought them in, a fee to a court clerk, and those fees would add up to a much larger sum. And in the end, many, many hundreds of people in the end were sentenced to terms of a year or 2 years of hard labor in a coal mine for a crime like vagrancy.
This leasing, was this a good revenue producer for the states?
It was a tremendous revenue producer, particularly in Alabama. We've gone back and calculated, and in the period for which records can be reconstructed, between about the turn of the century and 1920, this was not the majority, but it was often one of, if not the largest source of funds that the state had.
Are any of these companies still in existence?
Many of them are. There were dozens of American companies who participated in the practice, dozens just in Alabama. If you extend it across all the southern states, there may well have been hundreds. We focused on Alabama because the practice lasted so long there. And of those, many, many of these companies survive today in one form or another. One of them that is still today and existed as the same entity at the time this was happening was U.S. Steel Corporation, which purchased an Alabama company in 1907 that was engaged in this practice and merged with the company and made it a subsidiary, and then continued with the practice of convict leasing for a number of years after that. But there are also other companies that have a less direct lineage, companies like a New York Stock Exchange traded company called Walter Industries, which has a number of different industrial units, and one being Jim Walter Homes. But one of its units is called Sloss Industries, and that's a descendant over the course of a couple of mergers from another of the heaviest users of convict laborers at the turn of the century.
You got all this from public records. I wonder if the companies have kept any records on this use of leased prisoners.
For the most part, the companies that I've talked to are as unaware of this history as anyone else, and they reacted with surprise that this was in their past. In the case of U.S. Steel, they went back into their records and were helpful to a degree in trying to determine what documentation there was. They found very, very little. One memo from 1913 that referenced this practice, a map of a particular site that had a notation on it, those kinds of things. I haven't been able to discover much in the way of actual corporate records. What might be out there elsewhere is hard to know.
It's ugly, but it doesn't seem too surprising, is it, considering that rehabilitation is a more modern concept of prisons?
Well, I think that's true. It's also true, though, that there was an active debate even at this point in time about whether this was a good idea. Even among Alabamans, there was an active discussion among the political leaders about whether this ought to be happening and whether or not this amounted to a cruel regime, and also very specifically about whether there were large numbers of people ending up in the mines solely because of the financial incentives that had been created for local officials. And so, on the one hand, the system is a cruder form, perhaps, of privatized penal systems of today, but that may gloss over the depth of the mistreatment of individuals which occurred, which was really extraordinarily severe. And the conditions that existed in these prison mines, as described in these documents from that period, were brutal, is something of an understatement.
Tell me how you found out about this.
I ran across a reference while working on a different story a year or so ago about convict leasing, and at the time the German slave labor questions and lawsuits were heating up, and I got a bit curious about whether there might be living American corporations that had connected back to some sort of even roughly parallel kind of past, and so it developed from there.
Very good, thanks.
Thank you.
Doug Blackman is a reporter for the Wall Street Journal.
This is Talk of the Nation. I'm Neil Conan in Washington. Everybody knows that Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1862 and that after the Civil War ended, slavery was outlawed forever by constitutional amendment. Now, we need to rethink all that history. A new book argues that slavery continued in slightly different forms for another 80 years, that hundreds of thousands of men convicted of petty or non-existent crimes found themselves leased to white farmers to pick cotton or sold to companies to mine coal and smelt iron. Writer Douglas Blackman believes that this extension of slavery helps to explain why black Americans made so little economic progress between emancipation and the civil rights movement, and why suspicion and hostility to the justice system remain so deeply ingrained in African American communities to this day. Douglas Blackman joins us in just a moment. Later in the hour, how young women rationalize girls gone wild behavior on spring break, and your letters. But first, slavery by another name. If you have questions about where, when, and how this happened and what it means for us today, our number is 800-989-8255. The email address is talk@npr.org. You can also join the conversation on our blog at npr.org/blog of the nation. Douglas Blackman is Atlanta bureau chief of the Wall Street Journal. His new book is called Slavery by Another Name. He joins us now from the studios of Georgia Public Radio in Atlanta. Nice to have you on Talk of the Nation today.
Thanks for having me, Neil.
And tell us, who was Green Cottenham and why is he important?
Green Cottenham was a man whose parents were slaves on two different farms in the middle of Alabama before the Civil War. They were slaves of the kind that we think of as slaves. He was born in the 1880s after emancipation and what was supposed to be a time of freedom, but as he became an adult, he was drawn back into what I call this age of neo-slavery between the Civil War and World War II, and forced to work in a coal mine in Alabama that by then was owned by U.S. Steel Corporation, and he died there in 1908 under terrible circumstances. In fact, as of this week, it's exactly 100 years since the day that he was arrested on a trumped-up charge in Alabama and the saga began that led to his death.
In his case, the charge, I think, was vagrancy, but that was just one of what you describe as a number of laws passed in many states in the South to basically outlaw black lifestyle.
Exactly. By the turn of the 20th century, by about 1901, the entire criminal justice system of the South had been retooled in such a way where essentially it was criminal to be black. It was virtually impossible for an African American person to avoid breaking the law in one way or another. Every person was required to be able to prove at any time that they were employed. That was the vagrancy statute, but it was only enforced against blacks for the most part. No person could legally change jobs without the permission of their past employer. That was enforced only on blacks. That's a way of preventing a black man from leaving the farm of one white landowner and moving to the farm of another. And so there were myriad ways like this where it was nearly impossible for a young black man to avoid being dubbed a criminal if someone wanted to do that.
Yeah, there's a story you tell in the book about a black man by the name of his name was Jonathan Davis. He was a black man, ostensibly a free black man who worked his sharecropped a farm and had to go to see his ill wife. Hopped a train to do that. As he got off the train in a community in Alabama called Goodwater, he was confronted by a man named Robert Franklin, one of the town's appointed constables, who asked him, "Do you have any money?"
That's right. And the story of Jonathan Davis, and there are many, many stories in the book, and thousands of others that I couldn't get in the book. But the story of Jonathan Davis is, for me, one of the most poignant ones. He was a man who, as you said, his wife was dying, in fact, in the fall of 1901, and he left his field full of cotton ready to be picked. He abandoned his fields to try to make it to his in-laws' home in time to see her before she died. And on the way, he's confronted by this constable in the town of Goodwater. But what Davis fell into was not just one confrontation with one evil man. He was snared in what over the course of many years of research, I realized was an enormous and elaborate slave trafficking network. And this was something that was far beyond even the sort of formalized system of leasing prisoners out to businesses. This was where there was a man named John W. Pace who controlled several thousand acres of farmland and timberland in Alabama. And over the course of the 2 years that I studied, Pace, through a network of men like Robert Franklin, seized 40, 50, maybe as many as 100 black men, where they were simply seized from the roads as they walked from one place to another and were sold into this slavery, and many of whom, many didn't survive, many ended up as slaves for years and years, I believe some even decades.
Indeed, your search for their voices, the voice indeed of the man we talked about just at the beginning of the program, of Green Cottenham, your search for his testimony, what happened to him, his voice, you're never able to find it.
No, I finally found a relative of his who in my heart, as I talked to him, I had the sense that I was hearing the voice of Green Cottenham. But that's one of the most important things about this book is that the apocalyptic events that occurred in black life in America at the end of the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th century, one of the reasons that we have minimized them in modern times, and frankly that many conventional historians have tended to minimize, one of the reasons that's happened is because these were people who were impoverished, they were largely illiterate, there are not thousands of letters or diaries or the recorded memories of these millions of African Americans who lived in a kind of terror state in that time. And so we've lost those voices. And I spent much of my time on this book trying to reconstruct from the fragments that remain of the proof that these events occurred and that these people lived some sense of who they were, because our history has tended to focus on the people on the other side of the equation whose lives were very well documented, and that's a record that minimizes the scale of the tragedy and the evil that was perpetrated.
And how big a deal was this in terms of scale?
It was enormous. And some people, some historians will want to dispute me on this, but I think that the reality is that the record is obvious, particularly if you do what I did over the course of a very long period of time, which is to go from courthouse to courthouse across Alabama and Georgia and Florida and Mississippi and North Carolina and South Carolina. Many people assume that the records of this era don't exist anymore, and in some places they don't. But in many, many places, there are hundreds of thousands of pages of arrest records and agreements between sheriffs and companies and local politicians and landowners. There's an enormous record of a forced labor system that was monotonously huge. And by that, what I mean is that there were thousands and then tens of thousands of men who were directly forced into some kind of involuntary servitude through this cynically perverted judicial system. But in addition to that, that was the hammer that was hanging over the lives of every black man in the South. And so out of a fear of having those things happen, millions of black men and their families abided all of the other degradations that the white South perpetrated against blacks in the first half of the 20th century, much of which amounted to coerced labor in another form.
Our guest is Douglas Blackmon. His book is Slavery by Another Name, The Re-Enslavement of Black Americans from the Civil War to World War II. If you'd like to join the conversation, 800-989-8255. Email us, talk@npr.org. We'll begin with Ben, and Ben's calling us from Mocksville in North Carolina.
Hi, Neil. Yeah, I had a quick question. A statement, really. My great-grandfather was a Yugoslav immigrant, and he came to the South, West Virginia, and, of course, right around the Depression time. So he worked in the coal mines, and anyone will know, especially, and back in those days, a coal mine was just especially horrible condition. My grandfather was only given, as any other coal miner, company script. He had to buy from the company. The company probably overcharged in what the regular people did. And when I was thinking about this, because my mother and I have talked about it substantially, it's like, wow. In his own way, these coal miners, especially these immigrants who spoke no English, we're in a type of slavery. And, I really think, whites and blacks have far more parity than many would think, especially the lower class folks and immigrant folks, because, I feel more in common, especially as the grandson of a Yugoslav immigrant who died basically in the coal mines from black lung, than with my rich white counterparts. And I'll take my statement/answer off the line.
Okay, Ben, thanks very much for the call. And Douglas Blackmon, you do point out the vast majority of the people you'd write about in this system of leasing labor and various other forms of slavery by another name were African Americans, but by no means all.
That's right. There were whites who were sucked into this. By and large, I think that it was much more likely that a white man who was forced into, particularly through the prison system, who was forced into this kind of involuntary servitude, those generally were men who had committed crimes, but they were a microscopic number compared to the black workers. And one thing along the lines of what your caller was describing, there was a practice that echoed some of this in terms of immigrant laborers who were induced to move from the Northeast, from the immigrant arrival points in the Northeast, and to work on building railroads in the Florida Keys, coal mining in West Virginia, as he describes. I think what his grandfather experienced was actually more toward the end of the period of time that I write about. And so there were whites and there were some immigrants who were pulled into this. But the fact of the matter is that the scale of what happened to African Americans was vastly greater than everything else that happened to others.
And how profitable was this?
It was tremendously profitable. It was profitable both for the business enterprises that were involved in this, and it was incredibly lucrative for the southern states, particularly in places like Alabama, where where the coal mining industry and the steel making industry was booming at the end of the 19th century. This particular form of labor, this labor practice, worked really well in these coal mines. The type of work that was required was the sort of thing that these coerced workers could do, and these companies poured tens of millions of dollars into the coffers of state governments like Alabama's.
Our guest is Douglas Blackman. If you'd like to join our conversation about slavery by another name, the phone number is 800-989-8255. Email talk@npr.org. Stay with us. I'm Neil Conan. You're listening to Talk of the Nation from NPR News. This is Talk of the Nation. I'm Neil Conan in Washington. We're talking about the long tale of slavery. Under other names, it persisted for another 80 years after being outlawed by constitutional amendments. We're talking about Green Cottenham's enslavement in the coal mines in 1908, but his story is one of hundreds of thousands. You can read the stories of other re-enslaved black Americans in an excerpt at our website, npr.org/talk. Our guest is Douglas Blackman. His book is called Slavery by Another Name, The Re-Enslavement of Black Americans from the Civil War to World War II. And we want to hear from you. If you have questions or this period of history, give us a call, 800-989-8255. Email us, talk@npr.org, and check out our blog at npr.org/blog of the nation. And Douglas Blackman, there is a horrible perversity about this post-slavery system that in many ways was worse than slavery for those caught up in it.
That's right, Neil. One of the bitter ironies of this is that before the Civil War, in the antebellum slavery we're all more familiar with, slaves had great value to their owners. They were extremely expensive, and it was important to landowners to maintain their health over a long period of time and for them to procreate and give birth to more slaves because there was value to that. And so while there were terrible abuses in antebellum slavery, there was a strong economic incentive to at least ensure that slaves survived. In the system that I'm talking about, the neo-slavery practices after the Civil War, what emerged was a kind of brutally efficient economic rationale which viewed these workers more as equipment than as humans. And the value, the cost of acquiring them was so small that it was much more, the economic incentive for these companies and landowners was to work them as hard as possible, even if that meant working them to death, because they were easily replaced and inexpensively replaced.
And like Green Cottenham, once they died, they vanished, never to be heard from again.
Green Cottenham died in 1908, a diseased man, malnourished and sick, in a crude hospital at a mine owned by U.S. Steel Corp at the time. I searched for a very long time to try to find where he was buried. At the very beginning of my work on this, I was led to a graveyard near the mine location where he had worked that was a great burial field where clearly hundreds and hundreds of these workers had been dumped unceremoniously in graves, now overgrown. Eventually, I figured out that the grave site where he would have been buried was a short distance away, and actually just a few months ago, I went there still trying to locate where he was buried, and by then, but all signs of any kind of human activity there had been obliterated along with the old mine.
Let's get another caller on the line. This is Ozell. Ozell with us from Boston. Go ahead.
First of all, I have a comment, and then I have a question. In terms of slavery, I wanted to point out that a federal judge on August 15th, 1984, in Burke County, Georgia, ruled in a class action order that the Burke County Sheriff and the Commissioner's operation of the county jail violated the 13th Amendment prohibition against slavery. So I wanted to make sure that you understand this, that a federal court ruled as late as 1984 that there was a violation of the 13th Amendment by the county sheriff and the county commissioners in Burke County, Georgia. And you have to read a case called Rogers versus Lodge, which is the case ruled that met the requirement of proving a violation of the Voters' Rights Act by intentional discrimination before there was an amendment to the Voting Rights Act in the early 80s. Now, my comment, though, is...
That was a question?
Well, that was
a comment. Now go ahead.
Just to document that slavery is documented by a federal court.
I understand. Please go ahead.
Okay, my comment is, what is the difference between the the subject matter of Mr. Blackman's book, Slavery by Another Name, System of Leasing, and that of peonage, which was documented in a book by Pete Daniels, Shadow of Slavery, based upon research of, I guess, hundreds or thousands of United States Justice Department files of the unlawful system of peonage, for which there are federal laws that were enacted after slavery.
Douglas Blackman?
That's a great question, and you're obviously a serious student of these things. Pete Daniels' book, which came out in the mid-1960s, was a brilliant work on peonage. And what peonage is the practice of a person being held in a form of slavery specifically to pay off a debt or an alleged debt. And what that book wrote about, and which is also a part of my book, is this practice that became commonplace all across the South, particularly for sharecroppers, that if you worked on the land of a white farmer, the farmer would advance you the money to get through the season and for your seed and your tools and such. And at the end of the season, when the crop was sold, the idea was that the money would be divided up and it would pay back your debt to the landowner, and then you would end up with some cash yourself. The reality for millions of sharecroppers who got sucked into the system of peonage was that in reality the landowner always came up with a list of debts that was greater than whatever had been received from the crop. But that's a part of this, and I talk about Pete Daniels' book in my book. The thing that I would say is that what many historians in the past have not fully recognized is that there's been a tendency to look at this period of time as many separate things. The peonage was happening over here. Racial violence was happening over here. The prison leasing system was happening in another place. The intimidation of blacks from voting was happening in another place. Much of the point of my book is that those were not separate phenomenons. Those were all part of a very complicated system that was designed to intimidate the millions of black people living in the South right up until the verge of World War II.
And what about Ozell's other point that this was seemingly persistent into the 1980s?
Well, that's right, and there have been prosecutions on the statute that outlaws peonage, and prosecutions into the 50s and the 60s, and right up to the case that he talks about in the 1980s. But the point I would make, though, is that what I write about was a phenomenon that oppressed a vast population. Really, the majority of African Americans who lived in the United States up until World War II were affected by this in some explicit way. What came after World War II, for many reasons, including, and I talk about this in the book, that in 1942, partly in response to fears of Japanese propaganda, President Roosevelt ordered that the Department of Justice, for the first time, take seriously the reality that slaves were still being held in the South, and the Department of Justice mounted a serious criminal prosecution against a family in Texas for holding a man named Alfred Irving as a slave for many years, and the father and the daughter in that family were convicted and sentenced to prison. That was the first serious effort for 50 years, really, to prosecute someone for holding slaves, and that was the beginning of the end of this massive system. But it's certainly the case that there were incidents, terrible incidents like the one the caller describes, that continued for many decades after that.
Ozell, thanks very much.
Well, thank you all very much.
Bye-bye. Let's see if we can go to Valerie. Valerie's on the line with us from San Francisco in California.
Oh, hi.
Hi there.
I actually took the opportunity to read, it's one of two books on slavery that I'm reading right now, and I really enjoy your book, sir. I just
Thank
have
you.
a question. How surprised were you to learn that women were part of this slavery network as well? That comes up in the book. And we don't hear very much of women convicts being used as slaves.
That's true. There were women in the system, and I write about that periodically. It's a horrifying aspect, frankly, of all of this. Women were a tiny minority among those who were sucked into this system, but when they were, the part of what was happening was that there were there were what were thought of at the time women's roles, which were needed in these industrial settings as washerwomen and cooks and various other roles that were needed to help provide the food and the other necessities of these prison mines and prison camps, slave camps. And so there was a need for women in the system, and so women ended up in the system. Sadly, there were also terrible sexual predations that were perpetrated against many, many women.
And you mentioned that some of these companies that these slaves work for were actually the precursor to some of the Fortune 5000 companies that we're familiar with now.
That's right. And I'm glad you brought that up, because I hope that one of the things that readers will take away from this book is that this isn't just a sort of arcane history about things that happened a long time ago. The reason that I was moved by the things that I found to write the book was that I think that these events tell us much more about why things are the way they are in America today than the slavery that preceded the Civil War. And I mean that in two ways. One is that the reality is that slavery, honest-to-God slavery, in which black Americans were unable to begin the activities of freedom that would allow them to build wealth and over generations move into the kind of middle-class status that most white families have today, that process couldn't begin until 80 years later than most of us have generally believed. But the other side of that is that many of the biggest corporations in the South and some of the wealthiest families in America, the source of their wealth and the origins of some of these companies relates back to these events at the beginning of the 20th century. And one other thought on that is that in the book I go to some length to say none of this is intended to reflect poorly on the descendants of those people today, or even on companies that have some connection back to these events. But my point is that there are tangible connections between these events and today, including that the bricks that line the sidewalks in my neighborhood in Grant Park were made by slave laborers at a place called Chattahoochee Brick Company on the outskirts of Atlanta in the early 1900s. There's a real connection between our lives today and these events, and we need to come to terms with those connections.
The other connection you make is the hostility that so many African Americans feel toward the justice system in this country, based, you believe, at least in part, on this history of trumped-up, non-existent charges that could take people away into forced labor for years.
Well, that's right. The one thing that became clear to me in the course of working on this book and in conversations with living people who connect back to some of these events is that, number one, almost no one understands that these events occurred, whether they're black or white. And in fact, it's obvious why whites generally have tended to minimize these events. It's less obvious why African Americans would. But the truth is that many, many African Americans, for a very long time, tried hard to forget the humiliations and the tragedies of many of these years. At the same time, one cannot read this book and have any question as to why an ingrained sense of suspicion and hostility toward the judicial system became a fundamental element of African American perspectives.
Valerie, thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
We're talking with Douglas Blackman about Slavery by Another Name. You're listening to Talk of the Nation from NPR News. Let's go to Steve. Steve joins us from Oakland, California.
Hi, yes, excellent book. The recentness of all this, I think, is a premise as to why the business of the Civil War isn't accomplished to this very day. There was an earlier comment about how the laws were available to be used and were used against white labor as well, including immigrant labor, which strikes me as a little besides the point, because this system of slavery by another name that's being described together, it worked hand in hand with extra-legal terror to prevent labor organization, black and white. Blacks were supposed to be free laborers after the Civil War, and as you know, this obviously didn't happen. As far as I know, only the IWW tried to organize integrated organizations. The CIO paid some lip service and did a little bit, but I don't think made any serious attempt. And
Douglas Blackman,
it wasn't a lot of it because of this legal system that worked hand in hand with extra-legal terror.
And Douglas Blackman, you do write indeed about that, but also about the experiences of a black organizer. I think his name was Henry. I'm losing the last name, but he came to this area of Alabama, I think, in the 1940s, and talked to people who were describing the system and how it worked and the abuses they suffered, and he simply didn't believe it.
That's right. I in the epilogue of the book, there's a dialogue with an African American man who worked in the coal mines of Alabama, beginning in the 1930s or the 1940s, and spent all of his adult life there. There are very few people alive today who have any kind of living memory of anyone associated with these events. But this was one person who. Coal miners who were very young men in Alabama in the 1930s worked in coal mines with old men who had been forced into the coal mines in an earlier time under these circumstances. And so some of those men have some recollections of the stories they would hear. And there was this figure who you mentioned, who I questioned him at some length about whether he had heard accounts of the sort that I was beginning to resurface. And after a long time, he finally said, yes, I heard stories like that, but I never gave it any credence. And that was coming from an African-American man. And that gets to the point that I was making a moment ago, which is that for many, many people, these events are so horrifying and so terrorizing that both whites and blacks preferred not to remember them. But a point of this book is that I think we really can't have a shared vision for the future in our country unless we're willing to be honest about them and dredge them back up, even if that may be uncomfortable to do.
And connections not only to companies that we might own stock in, or memories of our ancestors who may have fought on one side or the other in the Civil War, but memories that, you're personally involved in this too, not just the bricks around the corner from your house.
Well, that's true. That isn't why that sort of wasn't why I began on the book, but I was surprised to find myself connected to the book in ways that I hadn't expected. But to back up a little bit, I was born in the Mississippi Delta in the fall of 1964, just after Freedom Summer, when Shorner, Goodman, and Cheney were murdered by the Ku Klux Klan, and there were churches burning all over Mississippi, and the Deep South was, the darkest years of the Civil Rights era were beginning. And then when I began first grade in a little cotton town, I was in the first class of children in Mississippi where blacks and whites began school together and went through 12 years of education together. And so as long as I can remember, I've been digging around trying to understand these things. And as I dug into the book, I also eventually found my own family, tying back to the place and some of the people in this book back in Alabama.
Douglas Blackman, thanks very much for your time today.
Thank you.
Douglas Blackman's book is Slavery by Another Name. He joined us from the studios of Georgia Public Radio in Atlanta. Coming up, we'll hear from you, your letters, and columnist Megan Daum examines the connection between body shots in Cancun and confidence for young women. That's next on Talk of the Nation from NPR News.
This is News and Notes. I'm Tony Cox, in for Farai Chidea, who is on vacation. The medical exploitation of African Americans has caused mistrust among patients and the medical industry. The most noted case is the Tuskegee experiment of the 1930s. 399 black men in late stages of syphilis were never told they had the disease. Then, when they were treated by doctors, they had no intention of curing them. This history of involuntary medical experimentation has created a complex relationship between black patients and non-black medical providers. NPR's Farai Chidea recently talked to Harriet Washington, bioethicist and author of Medical Apartheid, The Dark History of Medical Experimentation on Black Americans from Colonial Times to the Present. Washington began by explaining the incident that prompted Fannie Lou Hamer to become a civil rights activist.
Essentially what happened was she had undergone what she was told was an operation to remove what she described as a knot in her stomach. I believe it was probably a benign uterine fibroid, a very common condition among African-American women. And not until she was back at the plantation where she worked and lived did stories begin circulating. Apparently, the owner's wife was a cousin of the surgeon who performed the operation, and she knew, although Fannie Lou Hamer did not, that Fannie Lou Hamer's uterus had been removed, rendering her sterile. This was a very common practice. It was non-consensual, and gynecological surgeons often rendered Black women sterile without their knowledge while they were giving birth or undergoing other sorts of medical procedures. And Fannie Lou Hamer, who always spoke of wanting to have a family, was devastated but also angered by this. And this is what inspired her to, investigate political action as a means of seizing power. She tried to register to vote, was thrown off the plantation, and the rest, as they say, is history. She went on to become one of the most important civil rights leaders and symbols of the era.
Why did doctors go around sterilizing Black women, and how common was it?
Well, it's not a simple question at all. It's actually a very key question. It's very interesting because up until the abolition of slavery, Black fertility was prized. It was very important for Black women to breed more children who were more slaves, and therefore a very important source of wealth for owners. After slavery was abolished, these children were no longer valued. And the tenets of scientific racism, which medical science has used to justify and excuse many abusive practices and abusive research practices, were then expanded. Black people were sterilized at much higher rates than white people, and they were sterilized because they were posited as being both biologically and intellectually unfit parents.
This is one specific area of what you call medical apartheid. What is medical apartheid?
Medical apartheid has most commonly been used to refer to the race-driven, very wide disparities in access to health care, quality of health care, and protection of human rights. All these racial disparities have led to such a wide gulf, a gulf that's really riven our nation, to the point where 10 years ago, the health of Harlem men more closely resembles Bangladeshis than their Manhattan neighbors. And this is the picture throughout our entire country. Black people are dying in droves of detectable, preventable, curable diseases. This huge disparity has its roots in unexplored history, which was promulgated at the beginning of slavery to justify enslavement and medical abuse of Blacks, still exists today. And a lot of these racist beliefs, which are not scientifically supported but have been embraced by scientists, have driven the wide gulf in healthcare.
One of the historical incidents that provoked this disconnect between African Americans and the medical establishment was the Tuskegee experiment. Tell us about what was perpetrated.
The Tuskegee syphilis experiment, which is properly called the Public Health Service study of syphilis in untreated Negro males, is the most iconic symbol of abuse, of racialized medical abuse in research. It ran between roughly 1932 and 1973. In the late 20s, Julius Rosenwald, who was the owner of Sears Roebuck and Company, and Booker T. Washington decided to embark on a series of initiatives in part to eradicate infectious disease such as syphilis from the denizens of Macon County, where Tuskegee University was located. But Rosenwald lost his money in the stock market crash, and as a result, the Public Health Service stepped in. But the Public Health Service physicians never shared their goal of Black self-sufficiency or Black initiatives to address health. The Public Health Service had a very different agenda. They simply wanted to study the progression of syphilis in Black men. And they not only wanted to observe these men without treatment, but they also were hoping to validate their belief in a racially dimorphic difference of syphilis in Blacks and whites. Again, the tenets of scientific racism held that Black people were less intelligent, with underdeveloped nervous systems, however, were very strong physically. And the PHS physicians wanted to prove that syphilis did not attack the nervous systems of Blacks because their nervous systems were so quote-unquote primitive. Now, not treating these men, of course, condemned them to suffer the ravages of syphilis, not only them, but their children, their wives, their girlfriends. And essentially, this observational study resulted in the PHS physicians waiting for these men to die. It was very important for them to be able to autopsy them in order to try to prove their theory. And that's exactly what happened. For 40 years, they watched the men and waited for them to die.
There are people who keep this legacy alive, but it lives in more than just books like yours and in fictionalized works. Doesn't it live really in the Black psyche or how we react to medical professionals?
Absolutely. I think that the fear engendered by the widespread publication of the study has been very powerful in that for many Black people it validated fears that they had.
Let's move forward. You were not just talking about the past, you're talking about the present, and in some cases, towards the end of your book, the future of how race and medicine have interacted. What is one of the most troubling questions of medical experimentation that has gone on recently with African Americans?
Experimentation with children, extremely troubling. Experimentation with children is always tricky because children cannot give consent. And my research has found that their parents are actually not always the best people to render consent. That's troublesome enough. But what's happened with African American children is that their parents are much more likely to be bypassed by the system. African American children are much more likely to be subjected to non-therapeutic medical research, research that cannot help them. They're also much more likely to be residents of juvenile institutions or otherwise have their parents removed from the informed consent equation. So we've got a huge pool of African American children who are subjected to non-therapeutic, sometimes abusive research for which nobody who is close to them and has their interests at heart has ever given consent. In the 1970s, Johns Hopkins University sanctioned a researcher who was looking at a genetic anomaly, the XYY. And he was saying that children with this particular genetic anomaly might be more impulsive, which is often sociological parlance for violence. So he decided to investigate this question, but he investigated by looking at a population of thousands of boys, 85% of whom were Black. Fast forward 30 years, in New York City, the New York Psychiatric Institute and several revered universities, including Columbia University, engaged in similar research looking at possible genetic roots of violence. And they did that by looking at only Blacks. I read the protocol, which specifically excludes whites. So we have this very tenacious pattern of looking at genetics of violence, but only looking at Black boys.
Who has oversight of this? Why has there not been more oversight of how these experiments are conducted?
Excellent question. Various federal agencies, most directly the Office of Protection for Research Risks, they are supposed to enforce the Code of Federal Regulations, which says that if you have healthy boys, they cannot be subjected, healthy children, they cannot be subjected to research that might have more than a quote-unquote minimal risk. And that's how they exonerated these researchers. They looked at the study and decided it had only comprised minimal risk. I disagree. Here's a study in which boys were given a chemical which has been shown to be poisonous, cardiotoxic, a fenfluramine, half of the fen-phen weight combination. It was taken off the market because it was so dangerous, yet it was given to these young boys. In preparation for the experiment, they were taken off all their medications, including medications for life-threatening conditions like asthma, for a week. They were hospitalized overnight. Food was withheld. This constitutes more than minimal risk, in my opinion, and yet the government decided that this was an acceptable thing to do to healthy boys.
Does this pattern affect how African Americans are able to advocate for our own health care?
Absolutely. Although it may seem a strange message for someone who's written a book like this, I think it's very important for African Americans to embrace medical research after, of course, we've educated ourselves. In a country where we constitute about 13% of the population, we constitute 1% of voluntary research subjects. So we are clearly very wary of medical research, and that is harming us. So if we cut ourselves off from experimental therapies, we're cutting ourselves off from many possible treatments. Also, when we are not present in sufficient numbers in medical research, we are victimized because a drug that may not work as well for us, we will not know that.
And what about people who are not interested in research per se? They don't want to volunteer for clinical trials, but are just concerned, well, gee, if I go to the doctor, am I going to be put in a situation that is oppressive? Should we wholeheartedly embrace going to the established medical community with all of our needs?
We have to. I don't think we have a choice there. You have to, number one, find a primary care physician. Find someone you can trust. Because if you're not working in partnership with a physician, your quest for good health is already sabotaged. It's absolutely essential. We have got to find a way to put our fears behind us or conquer them and embrace the healthcare system. We've got the greatest healthcare system in the world in many aspects, and yet African Americans have an understandable wariness, which is cheating us of years of life and health. So find a doctor who you can trust and work with him or her to improve your health.
Well, Harriet, thank you so much.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
That was NPR's Faraj Chidea with Harriet Washington, author of Medical Apartheid, The Dark History of